Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to the third episode of The Apple and the Hero. My name is Sara Orfali, and today I would like to be your guide on the pathways of history. In the last episode, we had started traveling on one of the most important highways in the history of Italy, meeting the hero to whom we Italians owe the creation of our modern country, Giuseppe Garibaldi. A cosmopolitan man willing to take up arms in the defense of the people who chose to fight for freedom, Garibaldi was a hero for more than just the Italians. Already during his lifetime, he was known as the hero of two worlds, thanks to the heroic acts he had committed in service of the Rio Grandense Republic, trying to free itself from the Brazilian Empire, and the state of Uruguay, locked in a struggle against Argentina. His campaigns in the New World, to where he had fled after a failed Republican insurrection in the Kingdom of Sardinia in 1834, had given him a purpose, worldwide fame, an uncountable number of enemies, and the love of his life, Anita Garibaldi. Had he been another man, Garibaldi might have contented himself to live in Montevideo with Anita and his children, teaching math at a local school. Or maybe he would have gone back to the more profitable business of selling pasta, as he had been doing on his own ship when he had first come to Brazil in 1836, before he had decided to take up arms for freedom. But the teachings of the French philosopher Saint-Simon, which Garibaldi had discovered for the first time as a young sailor bound for Odessa, had been carved too deeply into his heart. And so, when the news came that the time was finally right for Italy to get rid of the Austrian invaders and start off the path towards unification, Garibaldi gave his resignation to the Uruguayan government and set sail once again towards Europe. Anita, his wife, had not wanted to be left behind. I honestly think she was a lot more interested in the cause than he ever was. And so she had gone ahead of him with the children towards Nice, where Garibaldi's family still lived. What was happening in Italy in this moment, though? I know that you're here to know more about the hero Garibaldi was, and that I'm risking your attention by putting more information on your plate, but I ask that you bear with me for a couple of more minutes while I tell you roughly what Italy was embroiled with at the time. Full disclosure, as a student, I never liked this part. Too many names, too many dates, too many political reasons to remember, and not quite enough stories, little anecdotes that would have made the characters so real and the history so much more engaging. For years, I thought that the big moment in which modern Italy was born had been nothing but arid political machinations of people in power playing Risk. And yet, as I revisited that chunk of history as an adult, looking for the story behind the propaganda, I found out that underneath the avalanche of data that every student in Italy has been buried with, there were real people capable and willing to make decisions with their hearts and not just with their heads. For example, the people of Milan, with their desperate desire to be rid of the Austrians, which had led to the insurrection known as the 5 Days of Milan. Far more brutal and bloodier than what I had been told in school, such a revolution happening in March 1848 set ablaze the hearts of the people living in Lombardy and Veneto, and put them on the path of unification with the Kingdom of Sardinia, which, at that time, was mostly made up by today's French region of Savoy, which included Nice, today's Piemonte and Sardinia, hence the name. In those 5 days of fire and blood, the city of Milan perpetrated their worst atrocities towards the Austrian garrison stationed in the city. And, as it's unfortunately the case in war, the Austrians gave it back as good as they got. But a garrison of 14,000 soldiers, even if armed to the teeth, couldn't hold out forever when an entire city of 160,000 people was out to get them. 4,000 Austrians dead later, General Radetzky, if you're familiar with the New Year's concert from Vienna or with Strauss' senior works, then yes, he is the one to whom Radetzky's march is dedicated. So General Radetzky decided it was in his best interest to flee Milan with what was left of his soldiers. I will try and be as clear as possible, because in that moment many pathways of history were coming to a head, and they got irreparably tangled with each other. Milan wasn't part of the Kingdom of Sardinia in that moment. As the presence of the Austrian garrison in the city might have told you, the city and the Lombardy region, along with the Veneto region, were under the control of the Austrian Empire. When Milan revolted, the city had taken an autonomous decision. It wasn't part of the Kingdom of Sardinia, so any decision or consequence impacted just the city itself. But when the King of Sardinia, Carlo Alberto I, saw General Radetzky flee from Milan with wounded soldiers and his tail between his legs, he saw a great opportunity. The moment Radetzky left Milan, King Carlo Alberto of Savoy declared war on the Austrian Empire. And he wasn't alone. All the other monarchs in Italy, including the Pope, who at the time was still the temporal leader of the state of the Church, which encompassed today's region of Lazio, sent troops to aid the Savoy dynasty. Why, do you ask? In that moment, Italy was still a country in pieces, with different ruling houses on its territory. There had been talks of uniting the different reigns into a sort of confederation ruled by the Pope, and the first step of that plan had been to get rid of the Austrians. This is the start of Italy's first war of independence. There were 3 of them, which ended in varying degrees of failure, except the second one, which we are going to see in more detail later, after which Italy was mostly united under the ruling House of Savoy. So, in 1848, we find King Carlo Alberto slowly following Radetzky as he marched his tired troops across Lombardy to try and get them to safety of their fortresses in Veneto. Carlo Alberto I was a youngish king, born under the reign of Napoleon, but he was completely lacking in warfare knowledge. On the other hand, General Radetzky was approaching his 82nd year of life, and while old, he hadn't gone yet senile, and his accumulating experience made him a formidable foe. The Sardinian army was composed of low-quality, high-quantity soldiers and entirely lacking in commanders. Radetzky's army, on the other hand, had a lower head count, but every soldier had been bred for war. I will gloss over many of the shameful episodes in this War of Independence, but just to give you an idea of the complete and utter mess that was the Sardinian army, let me tell you that the moment they crossed the last river between Lombardy and Veneto, they had to stop, because nobody had thought to buy geographical maps for the terrain ahead, and so nobody knew what could be waiting for them. In the midst of this chaos, with the army literally dying from hunger because the supply lines had been stretched too thin and were thus incapable of bringing food to the soldiers, on the 4th of July 1848, freshly arrived from the New World, Giuseppe Garibaldi presented himself to King Carlo Alberto I and offered his sword and expertise to the cause. Anybody with even just a lick of strategic sense and the ability to read a newspaper would have laid the world at Garibaldi's feet to secure his help. Carlo Alberto I, though, remembering Garibaldi as the scoundrel behind the failed insurrection in 1834, if you remember, our hero had been on the run from Savoy police who had put him to death, wanted nothing more than to get rid of him. We have records of the king telling his closest advisors that he'd gladly pay Garibaldi just to vanish from his sight. I think we need to step slightly off the main path to look at the history between Garibaldi and the Savoy dynasty, just to explain how things has gotten to this point. As I told you in the previous episode, in 1833 Garibaldi had met Mazzini in Marseille and had been convinced by him to join the newly founded Giovani Italia, whose scope was to create a united Italy under a republican government. Since the Savoy were an absolute monarchy, in 1834 Garibaldi had viewed them as his enemy and had not hesitated in trying to start an insurrection. Not even the fact that he was condemned to death was enough to put a damper on his enthusiasm. So when he reached the New World and started to sell spaghetti with his ships, Garibaldi named them Mazzini, Giovine Italia and Giovine Europa, and decided to fly the tricolour flag, the green, white and red flag which would later become Italy's flag, on 2 of his vessels. In 1836 the tricolour flag wasn't the country's flag, but the symbol of the insurgents. So it was a pretty strong message, the one that Garibaldi was sending, especially since he was still on the run from the police. When the Savoy ambassador in Brazil figured out that Garibaldi was flaunting the tricolour flag on vessels with seditious names, he wasn't exactly pleased. There was nothing he could do unless Garibaldi steered his ships in international waters. There was no treaty between the Brazilian empires and the Kingdom of Sardinia at the time, which would let one operate in the other's territory. But he had a plan ready if the occasion came, and 2 captains willing to dirty their hands and eliminate Garibaldi. As the ambassador shockingly put in one of the letters addressed to his superiors in Piemonte, "This is a small liberty one can take in America." These were the behind the scenes of the relationship between Garibaldi and the Savoy dynasty. Sure, there was the fact that, as a republican, Garibaldi's dream was to free the Italian people from all monarchs, not just the Bourbons in the south, the Pope in the center, and the Austrians in the north. And yet, this dreamer was also a very pragmatical person, a trait which has somehow been lost in the folds of history. He saw the struggle for freedom and put that sentiment before his republican sensibilities. And yet, neither the king nor his advisors seemed to be capable of putting their feelings aside and recognize the talent and clout that Garibaldi had earned in his years in the New World. We know from contemporary sources that when Princess Maria Adelaide, future Queen of Italy, was told that Garibaldi had presented himself to her father-in-law the king, she told her husband, "Accept Garibaldi? Oh, my angel, what sort of people are we taking in?" Not what I would call a show of acceptance, which was even more ridiculous since the Savoy were badly losing. They couldn't really afford to be that picky. In the end, a measure of common sense prevailed, probably helped by the increasingly terrible reports coming from the front. For all that Radetzky was approaching the end of his life, he had lost none of his shine and capability in war. So King Carlo Alberto gritted his teeth And while he didn't officially welcome Garibaldi into his army, he also made no motion to either imprison him on account of his old crime or send him again into exile. Not one to be too picky about what was given to him, Garibaldi made do with what he had. This is a good time to tell you that more often than not, our hero found himself at the head of a voluntarily militia. People who had been attracted by his personality and charisma and were ready to lay down their lives for his causes. The same thing happened again in 1848. With just this charisma, Garibaldi managed to rake up enough volunteers to be a thorn in the side of the Austrians. Radetzky had issued an order for his soldiers to kill Garibaldi on sight if they ever spotted him, which I think might have been taken as a compliment by our hero. With no support, they lost more than they won, but Garibaldi still managed to distinguish himself on the battlefield. 1849 was, I think, what Garibaldi himself would have referred to as Annus Horribilis. The year had started with Carlo Alberto's abdication in favour of his son, Vittorio Emanuele II, which had nothing to do with our hero, and soon after, Garibaldi hastily got himself to Rome in order to defend the newborn republic. This would shape up to be a terrible year for our hero, not just on the political front. Even though his efforts to keep Rome were in vain, and he was forced to flee, hunted like a dog at the end of the war, when he was forced into exile again by the new king. This would be a terrible year for our hero on the personal front. Although a mother of four, Anita had never quite resigned herself to the sidelines. Her revolutionary heart beat strong in her chest, and so she hardly stayed in Nice with her mother-in-law, but had come over and over again to where her Jose had been stationed. When Garibaldi had gotten to Rome, Anita had followed, regardless of his pleas to stay behind, since she was 4 months pregnant with her 5th child and was suffering from malaria. He had clearly not expected her, but he must have loved her very, very much, and he must have appreciated her courage and her heart, because we know from Alexander Dumas, at the time a Garibaldino, a soldier in Garibaldi's army, that the moment he saw her appearing in front of him in his encampment, he simply said to the soldiers, "This is Anita. Now we have one more soldier with us." When the entire venture looked lost, with the Bourbons and the French coming to the Pope's aid in getting rid of the newborn Roman Republic, Garibaldi and Anita fled together one last time. It wasn't the first time Anita had to flee to survive. You might remember her daring escapes on horseback in South America, but this time she would not be as lucky. Devastated by tertian fever and a difficult pregnancy, Anita still wanted to the very end to remain by her Jose's side, refusing every plea from him to just find some benefactor along the way and hide there. She died in his arms at just 28 years of age, with the child she was carrying. Hunted as he was, Garibaldi couldn't even stop to properly bury her. It would be 10 years before our hero and his sons could come back to properly collect Anita's body and give it the burial she deserved in Nice. Her journey, though, doesn't stop there. In 1932, the Vatican issued a private request to Mussolini to take off the statue of Garibaldi from the Gianicolo Hill in Rome. The Duce accepted, but decided to switch the statue of Giuseppe Garibaldi with a statue of Anita Garibaldi. He also managed to get her remains from Nice and bury them underneath the monument. Not many people know that this monument exists. hidden as it is under Janicolo Hill. It is a pity, though, because I think the sculpture managed to capture Anita's essence perfectly. She is on a horse, with the firstborn Menotti strapped to her breast, capturing forever her courageous escape in Brazil. This monument is not just one of the very few statues of women in Italy, but it is also the only one showing a woman on horseback. I would imagine that Garibaldi might have felt a little lost after Anita's death. He had loved her ardently and completely, and while he did remarry later in life, twice, and had quite a number of lovers from different social classes, Anita would remain the love of his life. For his part in the Roman insurrection, Garibaldi was sent into exile once again. He still chose the American continent, but this time he went north, not south. He spent some months in New York, working in a candle factory owned by Antonio Meucci, the inventor of the first machine capable of communicating through great distances, which historians now call the first telephone machine. Then his wanderlust struck again, and he went back to South America and on his beloved seas, once again trading with countries as far away as China or Australia. Was Garibaldi destined to wander the seas forever? No. I told you at the beginning that he had been pivotal in creating Italy as it is, and I know I've dragged you quite literally across the world to follow the adventures of his hero, barely mentioning Italy in the process. I thank you all for having followed me until now, and as a reward for your patience, we are finally going to open the most important chapter, if not of Garibaldi's life, certainly of Italy's destiny. I think you will all agree with me that Garibaldi had no real reason to ever return to Italy. The king and the nobles of the Kingdom of Sardinia had barely been able to control their scorn and prejudices around him, and they had done nothing to endear themselves to him. But Garibaldi was the hero of the people, and the people of Italy had yet to be free. In 1854, Garibaldi decided to give the Kingdom of Sardinia another chance. There was no revolution on the horizon, but maybe our hero was tired of wandering alone and just wanted to come home. He bought a house on the island of Caprera and spent there his years until 1858, travelling around, meeting Mazzini in London. He would then publicly reject him and his ideas in 1858, and mostly being just a farmer. In those years, the Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Sardinia, Camillo Benso, Count of Cavour, had done his very best to lay down the groundwork which would bring about the Second War of Independence, by allying the kingdom with the French Empire of Napoleon III. Cavour was quite different from the rest of the king's cabinet and the other nobles. Personally, he would never be able to stand Garibaldi, but politically he saw his value and acted accordingly. He offered Garibaldi the position of Major General in the newly created regiment of the Cacciatori delle Alpi, and when he accepted, Cavour had all the pieces on his board to start another war with the Austrians. The objective, as the war before, was to boot the Austrians out of Lombardy and Veneto and unify those territories under the banner of the House of Savoy. Some of you might have noticed the discrepancy. Why would Garibaldi, a notorious Republican, serve in a clearly monarchic army whose goal was to unify the people under a king, not a democracy? Regardless of what his enemies and most of his contemporaries thought of him, Garibaldi wasn't stupid. The man who is remembered as naive and easily duped by any and every cause, as long as it was for freedom, did the most remarkable thing on the verge of the Second War of Independence. Garibaldi declared to all who would listen to him that Italy could be united only under the Savoy banner, and that he was willing to loyally serve the king to achieve his goal. The die-hard Republican serving a king? I think you'd concur with me that this is not the decision of some naive country bumpkin, right? What Garibaldi had realized was that in that moment, the best bet to unify Italy was the House of Savoy. As a practical man, he chose the surest and quickest way to achieve his goals. He had seen what Mazzini's inflexible desires of creating a republic had come to, and he knew that this was not the path he wanted to take. It was in 1860 that Garibaldi started to write history. He had fought in some battles against the Austrians already, gaining fame and victories. On the 11th of July 1859, though, politics dealt a disappointing blow to Garibaldi's dream of glory. Napoleon III, the French emperor allied with the Kingdom of Sardinia, decided to stipulate the so-called Armistice of Villafranca between his army and the Austrians. This was definitely not what the Prime Minister Cavour had planned, and when King Vittorio Emanuele II signed the armistice as well, Cavour had a conniption fit. Quite literally, since we have reports that people heard the king and his minister scream at each other. The Prime Minister then left the role, only to be called back later because nobody had any idea what to do. The armistice had given Lombardy to the Kingdom of Sardinia, but kept Veneto in the hands of the Austrians. Since Garibaldi's objective had been, at a minimum, to free those people, being stopped one step short of his goal had left quite a bitter taste in his mouth. He didn't know it then, but he would unfortunately become very accustomed to such taste. It was clear that, for the moment, the North had reached a stable equilibrium, but the South was still in the hands of the Bourbons. If the government wasn't going to do anything over the table, Garibaldi had no qualms about doing things under it. He went back to his roots and called for volunteers. 1,000 people answered his summons and gathered at Quarto, ready to embark in one of the brashest, most courageous and maddest ventures of the 19th century. We know that among these volunteers there were 250 lawyers, 100 doctors, 50 engineers, and 1 woman. I wonder if Garibaldi felt Anita's absence in that moment. I would like to think that he did. The Mille, as they are known in Italy, were armed, and some of them clad in the famous red shirts that had always characterized Garibaldi's troops. Legend has it that the first time the red shirts debuted was in Montevideo, when Garibaldi had bought a sort of uniform to distinguish the men in his Italian legion. He had bought a batch of red shirts destined to butchers. The material was red in order to disguise the bloodstains that had sat unsold due to the war. After that, the red shirt had become the official uniform of sorts for the troops serving under Garibaldi. The deep red color made the soldiers much more visible on the battlefield, but it also underlined their courage. As I said, at the moment of the first sailing, not everyone owned a red shirt. It would fall on Alexander Dumas to start a small production of them on the journey. With 2 stolen vessels, Garibaldi and his Mille sailed from Quarto in the night between the 5th and the 6th of May 1860. That's when things got a lot more interesting. Officially, Garibaldi had been given no orders neither from the Prime Minister nor from the King. Officially, After a night of panic, the Kingdom of Sardinia decided that its best course of action was to sit back and watch, while verbally condemning such a rash action. Cavour, as I said, was cunning. He had figured out what Garibaldi was about to do before our hero started doing it. After all, it wasn't that difficult to surmise the outcome when the premises had been Garibaldi buying all the weapons he could find and calling for volunteers from all over Europe. Cavour had surmised the plan, and he also knew that he had no way to stop it. Of course, Cavour could order the police to arrest Garibaldi and his mille before they could leave Quarto, but doing so would have been as good as declaring a political suicide. Still, Napoleon III and the Bourbons and the Pope were not particularly enthusiastic about this hero of the people, and so Cavour had no choice but to play a double game. He prepared the order to arrest Garibaldi and his men. He just accidentally forgot to send it in time. The order was delivered 24 hours later, when the ships had already sailed. The Savoy police had the order to arrest Garibaldi and the others if they came ashore on Savoy territory, but our hero pointed directly towards Sicily, and on the 11th of March 1860, he arrived in Marsala. As I said, Garibaldi had never received an official order, and he was completely unaware of the utter political mess he had left behind and of what the double-playing Cavour was doing behind his back. He was totally convinced that he had the backing of the king, and we know this because when he exited his ship in Marsala, he was wearing not a red shirt, but his official uniform as the Savoy general. The moment he set one foot on Sicilian soil, he declared himself dictator of the island in the name of the King of Italy, first time anyone had used this moniker, Vittorio Emanuele II. The people in Sicily rioted and joined the red shirts. Garibaldi had started out with 1,000 people, but by the end of his triumphant cavalcade through Sicily, he had over 50,000. In the Battle of Calatafimi, some days after his arrival in Marsala, Garibaldi uttered one of those sentences that are forever remembered in history. Either we make Italy here, or we die. His heroic deeds had created a craze around Europe. The newspapers had gone wild with the coverage of Garibaldi's feats. Everybody wanted to participate in the expedition. The workers in Glasgow and the dock workers in Liverpool worked for free during their downtime to send crates upon crates of ammunition and medicine to Garibaldi and his troops. Even the Tsars of Russia, who technically should have been allies of the very Bourbons Garibaldi was flattening along the way, were great fans of the heroic general. We know from Bakunin, the Russian anarchist in exile in Irkutsk, that the entire city waited with bated breath for the newspaper with the news on Garibaldi and his mille. Less than 3 months after his arrival, the island of Sicily had fallen entirely into Garibaldi's hands. On the 27th of July 1860, he stood in Messina, ready to take his troops across the sea into the mainland. As he was waiting, he was approached by a royal messenger bearing 2 missives for the general. In the first one, the official one, the king ordered Garibaldi to cease and desist, to stop the bloody war between Italians and Italians. The second one, though, the private one, bore more or less the message, "Good job, chap, just say no to the official one and keep going." As ordered, Garibaldi politely refused the king, telling him that they had gone too far to stop now, and crossed over into Calabria. The Bourbonic reign had been on the verge of collapsing for quite some years. Garibaldi's arrival had been just a final push. The kingdom of the 2 Sicilies quietly disintegrated under the Mille's boots, and Garibaldi was officially invited to Napoli, which he reached comfortably by train. Much more politically savvy than what his enemies thought of him, his first port of calling in Napoli had been the Duomo of San Gennaro, patron saint of the city, where for all who still didn't believe he was the chosen one, the blood of San Gennaro liquefied the moment Garibaldi arrived. For all of you who don't know what I'm talking about, a miracle usually happens twice a year in the Duomo in Napoli. The blood of San Gennaro, which is usually dry, turns liquid. If it doesn't, it's considered a bad omen. Take into consideration that when it didn't turn liquid in recent times, one time the Vesuvio exploded, the other the COVID pandemic started. Garibaldi was now in Naples, victorious, doing his very best to administer such a vast territory. The world had calmed down, its thirst for heroic deeds satisfied. The King of Sardinia, Vittorio Emanuele II, and his minister, though, were in a state of panic. They had turned a blind eye on the Miller's departure, planning to claim the spoils if Garibaldi was victorious, or discard him without a second thought if he's lost. What they hadn't seen coming at all had been Garibaldi cutting through the Bourbons like a hot knife in butter and getting too close to Rome. Moreover, none of them had actually foreseen the quite frankly ridiculous amount of fame that Garibaldi had raked up all over the world. Jealousy bred malcontent. Malcontent bred suspicion. What if Garibaldi was trying to create a republic in the south? Not the kingdom of Savoy he had promised, but a democracy of the people. The word assassination came up in conversations, even though later everyone would deny it. In order to stop Garibaldi, the king, Vittorio Emanuele II, decided to go with his troops towards the south of Italy. As children, we have been told that Vittorio Emanuele II had gone to meet Garibaldi in Teano to receive from him the south of Italy. Which, in a way, it's true. At least in Garibaldi's perspective. The general had never thought about keeping the territories for himself. His goal had always been to give them back to the King of Sardinia. From the king's perspective, though, he had hurried to Teano to stop a possible insurrection. I imagine that receiving the territories might have come as a surprise. In this occasion, everything is resolved peacefully, with Garibaldi none the wiser to the target he had carried on his back. Having done his part, our hero went back to Caprera. Italy was done, but he was missing quite a central piece. Rome was still in the hands of the Pope. In 1862, to try and conquer Rome, Garibaldi once again joined the battlefield. The script is the same. A call for volunteers, nobody stopping them in case the king might agree with it, a sense of camaraderie all around. This time, though, it's not meant to be. Rome and Lazio are protected by the French, an allied strong power, not the crumbling mess of the House of Bourbon. Vittorio Emanuele II cannot afford to step on French toes. Garibaldi cannot be allowed to storm Rome. Garibaldi's militia and the Savoy met in Aspromonte. If we read the pro-Garibaldi version, the red shirts had been told not to shoot and had been shot at. If we read the letters that General Cialdini sent the king, we discover that he faced hundreds, if not thousands of people, all armed to the teeth, and after a long and bloody battle, he had emerged victorious at last. We will never know the truth, but I think one version is much more probable than the others, don't you? Of the 44th wounded, we have to count Garibaldi twice, which makes it quite clear that they were gunning for him. He was arrested and put on trial. The reaction had been violent and all against the government. Garibaldi had become too much of a symbol to be rid of him so publicly. Before anyone would suggest a military trial, in which the public could not participate, friends of the hero made known to the king that they were in possession of certain letters signed by His Majesty, where Vittorio Emanuele II had given quite the open support to Garibaldi in his desires to conquer Rome. Such letters could not come to light, and so the king quietly released Garibaldi. At this point, I don't think anyone would have blamed our hero if he had decided to retire and live the rest of his life in the quiet and peace of Caprera. But Garibaldi was a hero of the people through and through. Regardless of the disappointment, he once again took arms in the Savoy army to try and conquer the Veneto region in the third and last War of Independence. He was the only one to manage a victory against the Austrians, but as he was about to conquer the city of Trento, he was stopped by an order of General La Marmora, who wanted all troops out of the Trentino region as the Prussians, allied to the Italians, were about to sign an armistice with the Austrians. The lapidary answer Garibaldi gave via another telegram went down in history. He simply wrote, "I obey." Italy would need to wait another half a century until the end of World War I to get the cities of Trento and Trieste. At this point, only Rome remained. As it had become quite the personal crusade for Garibaldi, our hero mustered yet another voluntary militia and tried to conquer the Holy City once again. And once again, in 1867, the King, Vittorio Emanuele II, ended up working against this general. Whether he did it on purpose or not, that we still don't know, he disavowed Garibaldi's initiative, causing him to lose half of his volunteers and thus be defeated in the Battle of Mentana. Garibaldi would never fight for the House of Savoy ever again. Probably one too many disappointments over the years he had spent bleeding for their cause. But the grisly general hadn't yet put away his sword forever. In 1860, he went to France to offer his aid to the newborn French Republic, desperately locked in a war with the Prussians. He might have been old, and he had to be carried onto the battlefield, but he had lost none of his luster. In a series of French defeats, his was a lonely victory, managing to defend the city of Dijon. I can't say that the French really appreciated his effort, even though Victor Hugo went quite a long way into defending Garibaldi in Parliament. He died in 1882 of old age in Caprera, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. His death made the front page of every newspaper in the world. Garibaldi had truly been a citizen of the world, a cosmopolitan hero who had given everything for freedom. Regardless of what his contemporaries and also posterity think of him, he was a man ahead of his time. He wanted free education for everybody. He was in favor of universal vote. He was hostile to colonialism and in favor of creating a League of Nations with an international arbitrate. He saw a world so much ahead of his time that we might even call him a visionary. He had his faults, without doubt, but he has earned his place among the heroes and legends of Europe. Kings, queens, heads of state might not have liked him as much as the common people, but they all readily recognized his qualities. As Princess Vicky wrote in a letter to her mother, Queen Victoria of England, he was a hero and a patriot, and his homeland owes him a lot. We have finally arrived at the end of our story. It's been a long, long journey, and I really want to thank you, my fellow travelers, because you have stuck with me until the very end. I've told you a lot of things, but I've had to cut out many more. In-depth explorations of Coralie characters, silly anecdotes on Garibaldi and his adventures. I've got them all written, but there hasn't been enough space for all of them in the final cut of the episode. This got me thinking, I don't want to leave them all there, gathering dust, never to be used. I want you all to enjoy them as I did. Therefore, I have created a website for my podcast, www.theappleandthehero.com, where you can join my newsletter and receive all the behind the scenes that didn't find space in the final versions of the episodes. I would love for you to join the community of the Apple and the Hero. I will also wait for you here in 2 weeks, when I'll guide you on the historical paths of France, looking for a heroine this time, one who helped shape a nation. As always, all the research has been done by me, Sara Orfali, Doctor of History. If you've liked it, please hit the subscribe button. Goodbye, everyone. Safe travels.